welcome everybody to our first research webinar on behalf of ELSO. Happy to kick things off today. My name is Eddie Fan. I'm coming from the University of Toronto here in Toronto, Canada. I'm joined by a fantastic international panel today, and hopefully this will be a very stimulating start to a research series of webinars aimed at trying to increase everyone's sort of understanding of research in ECMO and maybe providing some tips from experts that we can draw on to help the broader ELSO community. Today, we decided to start with a webinar on how to conduct observational research in ECMO. And I think this is a good place to start since much of the research that we do in ECMO is actually observational in nature. And we'll be speaking a bit about that today. So I'm joined by a fantastic panel, as I mentioned, including just in alphabetical order, Daryl Abrams from Columbia University in New York City, New York, Mela Bembia, who's coming to us from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and Mathieu Schmidt coming to us from La Pitié Salpêtrière in Paris. So welcome, panelists. And so what we'd like to invite everyone, before we get started, maybe perhaps we could just have a quick look at our disclosures for the panel, just to keep everything completely explicit. So here are disclosures for the members of the panel. Great, thank you very much. And so what we have some questions to get the discussion going, sort of to feed into some important issues about the design and conduct of observational studies, but really invite you, the audience, to enter questions in the Q&A box that we and the panel could hopefully address and help answer interesting questions that you might have as we proceed. So without further ado, I'm just going to get started. And again, just to say that, again, our focus here is on observational studies because as we've seen in both the long and the more recent history in ECMO is that conducting clinical trials is very difficult, especially randomized controlled trials in the device space with a complex intervention like ECMO, as well as in critical care in general. So there's a very important role for observational research. And so maybe I could start by asking Mathieu, what kinds of questions are best answered by observational research or observational studies? And how best can we sort of develop and refine the research questions so that it would be feasible to answer with observational data?
I do agree with you. I think starting with observational study before RCT is almost mandatory because it will help you to generate and define the right hypothesis, the right question. And as you said, considering the difficulties of running an RCT, especially on ECMO, with the cost, the time, the resource consuming, the limited number of patients as well, it's very tricky. So for observational study, I think we can answer to many questions. I think we have to think about which kind of study we want to do. And also it's mainly driven by which question we want to answer to. And in fact, I think there is almost two large groups of observational study. You have cohort study where you just which could be prospective or retrospective. So with this kind of design, you can answer easy question. I mean, what is the outcome of this group of patients? What is the outcome of this disease? What is the outcome of this patient? Or you can also think about investigating the management, meaning like how do we ventilate ECMO patient in large ECMO department? I mean, in large center with experience, how do they ventilate their patient? You can do same thing with transfusion, with management. And so this cohort study is useful to describe something which could be in prospective and retrospective, depending of what is the frequency of the disease, for example. So it has been done many times in the ECMO field when you focus on specific subgroups For example, if you want to describe what is the prognosis of pregnant women on ECMO, clearly you can only do that with observational studies. So it could be prospective or retrospective. And the second big group, in my opinion, the second one is to do some observational study with an attempt to understand cause and effect relationship. And this is much more complex because you have to properly define what is a question, and because you don't have any randomization, so you need to have to cope with several of aspects, and because non-experimental studies do not have the benefit of randomization, so it even requires more careful design to properly answer the question. And so to understand cause and effect relationship, you have several ways to do it. You have simple way to do it with multivariable analysis, for example, which is maybe the most common way to do it. And you have now much more complex statistical analysis with matching, with emulated trial. You have much more complex analysis to try to simulate randomization. But I think in observational study, to properly answer the question, you have to define it first. What is your real question at baseline? What is the question? What do you do that? And to find the way to limit at the maximum the confounding factors, which is one of the, we will discuss that later, I think, but which is one of the main point and main issue with this kind of study. But I think you can partially, at least, answer to many questions, especially in the ECMO field.
That's great. Thanks, Mathieu. I think highlighting a number of very important points there, some that which we'll also discuss, but really defining the question, figuring out what you're trying to answer, and this is germane to all kinds of research, observational or otherwise, is really key in the research process. Daryl or Mela, do you guys have any other additional comments?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with obviously everything Mathieu said. I think, you know, a lot of what you're trying to accomplish with some of these more complex statistical analyses require much larger numbers of patients, which kind of ultimately would require, and I think we'll also get to this a little bit, you know, multi-center studies as opposed to being able to do things just at your own center. And I think it's important to kind of keep an eye on, you know, how effectively you can be able to answer the question. And also, you know, how publishable is it? How reproducible is it? How generalizable? Because it's one thing for you to find this maybe at your own center if you find a positive result, but really making sure that this is something that, you know, would be applicable to a larger ECMO population. But I think, you know, we can discuss some of the pros and cons of single and multi-center studies a little later in this panel.
And I agree with everything that's been said. Something else that in terms of what questions can be answered and how to refine those questions, an advantage of observational studies is that they can also allow discovery of new or yet unknown or yet undescribed pathophysiological pathways, for example, or new monitoring methods, whether they're physiology-based, high-resolution waveform data, or whether they're biofluid biomarkers of organ dysfunction or organ recovery. Those types of questions can be answered very nicely using observational studies. I think that's the only sort of addition that I had to make.
That's great. Thanks all. Yes, I think it's, again, important to highlight that a multitude of important clinical questions or mechanistic questions or discovery questions could be answered through observational research. So it's really the first thing I think all the panelists have mentioned is that, you know, as much as we place a strong emphasis in medicine on the clinical trial and randomization, that there's a place, an important place for observational research. And I think what you're hearing is that a key point of, again, of any research is really defining the question. Once you know what you want to answer, then you could figure out the best study design or the best kind of data to gather to answer that question. And again, Mathieu laid out very nicely that observational data or studies could answer a number of questions, and Mela and Daryl added to that. And also to just remember that science is iterative. We build from answering, small questions or testing hypotheses and move to bigger and bigger studies, and perhaps some eventually will get tested in clinical trials. But again, that all these sorts of study designs have their important place in the discovery or scientific process. So maybe sorry.
No, I would totally agree, and we have to keep in mind that all RCT in ICU have started with heaps of observational studies, and I don't know any RCT which tried to answer a specific question without any observational studies before. It's even very difficult to get funded if you have no observational studies before who show a tendency or who show something that could generate a strong hypothesis to get funded.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And again, just highlighting the fact that, that's how science works. We build from, simple observations, maybe at the bedside or clinically, to then maybe a more systematic look through observational studies that you've heard the panelists describe. And then eventually, when we have enough data to suggest that there's a intervention or some algorithm or protocol to test it experimentally, that's sort of, you need all this background work, if you will, to build towards that. And certainly, as Mathieu's describing for funding agencies, especially how competitive funding is for research these days, you really need to have that pilot work or data to support, investing the time, resources, and money into investigating those questions in clinical trials, which are often very resource intensive and take a lot of time to complete. So no doubt. So go ahead.
And I would also add that even before then, even before starting an observational study, there's some groundwork to do. And Eddie, you're from Toronto, and we look a lot at the Canadian Canadian Clinical Research Trial and Critical Care Trials groups. I'm sorry, and sort of the pathway, right? That's been published and that's been so incredibly successful. So even before conducting some of the observational studies that then will lead to answering more specific questions through an RCT, there are steps before that, including a systematic review of the literature, perhaps a survey of current clinical practice in that area, whatever the topic is. So there's a continuum of how research gets started for any item, really. And we all have to rely on each other to get it started and to move it forward on that continuum.
I do.
Yeah, and we have also to accept that some question will never be answered by a RCT. I mean, especially on ECMO, we are dealing with quite a few patients per year in every center. Even if we do a multi-center analysis from some subgroup, you will never get a RCT doable. I mean, or otherwise you need 10 years or 20 years to run it, which is totally unfeasible. So we have to accept that some well-conducted observational study will provide the best evidence that it's possible to do, and especially on ECMO, I think.
Agree completely. I think those are all great points. So maybe just as a plug from Mela's great points. So we will have some future webinars focused on some of those topics like surveys and systematic reviews. And I think sort of having that continuum that Mela described that is been published about sort of the format of understanding current practice, then moving to an observational study to sort of design or refine what will eventually be studied in a clinical trial from the Canadian Critical Trials Group shows that in this continuum of science, we hope this will spur interest in the membership, because at every point you could be involved in some way, shape, or form from your center in some kind of very important and pivotal research that helps to move the field forward incrementally, but iteratively. And that's how science works, and especially in a field like ECMO. And second to Mathieu's very good point is that there are some things that we ultimately will never be able to test in randomized control trials. One, maybe because it's not ethical, or two, because we just don't have the resources, the time, or the ability to answer those questions. So, things like, the classic example that came out of work from Harvard is that, linking smoking to lung cancer. We were never going to randomize patients to smoking or non-smoking to understand the causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. But very sophisticated and well-conducted observational studies eventually provided that link. And of course, you're probably aware that link was critical in the litigation against tobacco companies in understanding the consequences of smoking. So, and I think we're starting to see that as, data from the United States showing that, trials of medical device approval or medical drug approvals are now approaching $100 million. It's becoming less and less likely that even large pharmaceutical or device manufacturers may embark on these large pivotal randomized control trials. And so for many important questions, we might be looking to very well-designed observational studies, as Mathieu had mentioned. So great discussion. Again, if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to insert them into the Q&A box. So maybe we can move to the next question, which is, so we've talked a lot about the different designs, the different studies, the kinds of questions that we could ask. So once you sort of defined or refined or thought about those questions, maybe I could ask Mela, how best do we proceed from there? Like, how do I then, I've got my question in hand, I'm enthusiastic, I've got my research team assembled. So how do I get the data? Where do I go next? How best to sort of start to answer these questions?
Yeah, that's a big question. There's so many different sources of data, right? So I think starting sort of at a higher level, there are multiple registries, of course, and data that already exist and that have already been collected for various reasons. We're all part of ELSO. And the ELSO registry, of course, is a tremendous resource for study. There are several other prospectively collected registries, including for those interested, for example, in ECPR. Here in the US, there is the American Heart Association Get With the Guidelines Resuscitation Registry that collects very detailed data on patients who have cardiac arrest events of all ages, pediatric as well as adults. And there are many similar cardiac arrest registries elsewhere. There tend to be nationwide registries, and the ones in Denmark, for example, or Japan are extremely, extremely well organized. Amazing data sources. And then for specific patient populations, there are parent registries of whom ECMO patients represent a subsection. And some of those registries are, again, extremely well done. And I'm thinking of things like the SDS database, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons database, for example, or in pediatrics, the PC4 database, which is the pediatric, I should stop trying to reproduce abbreviations, Pediatric Cardiac Critical Care Collaborative, so PC4. Yeah, there are many more examples such as that. There are administrative data. Again, it goes back to what question somebody has. There are administrative data sets that are also available, including those that have billing data. The FIS database, for example, comes to mind. And some other ICU-wide data sets and prospective registries. And then again, depending on the question and depending on the scope of a project, one can, of course, reach out to collaborators at other institutions or develop their own data set within their own institution. And then moving forward from just data to data plus, again, prospectively collected biofluids or radiographic images or high resolution physiologic data, that really the sky is the limit, right? So can be anything and everything from a small single center pilot study all the way to large multi-center prospective studies. I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh, I think that's great. Thank you. That's a fantastic, a succinct overview of sort of some of the considerations and resources that perhaps people who are getting started, again, as you mentioned, Mello, depending on their question, could tap. And in fact, there's a few questions in the chat now about the multi-center studies and collaboration. But maybe just before we get to that, which is a very important question, and Mello sort of touched on, maybe just as a specific example of a resource, an excellent resource that is available and has been used in our field to produce many important landmark studies is the ELSO registry, which I'm sure many on the call are familiar with. And perhaps I could just, before we answer some of these questions, ask Peter Reiches, sort of our resident expert on all things ELSO, to perhaps give a brief overview of how interested members, if their question could be answered or could be explored using data from the ELSO registry, how we might go about doing that. And of course, there are many web links that we provided and we can provide again at the end of the webinar to help provide extra detail on that. So Peter, maybe you could give us a quick overview on that. That would be great.
Absolutely. I know many of the attendees have actually requested data many times, and for them, they'll already understand this, but if you are part of an active ELSO center and wish to request data for publication, go to the ELSO registry under the registry tab, and there's a data request section. And from there, you'll download a form which you'll fill out. And then what will happen is a listed director or coordinator will mail it in to the ELSO data request email address, which is listed on the form. And then that goes to the Scientific Oversight Committee, which meets once a month. They will review your application to see what question you are asking, if we can be answered, if the statistical analysis is sound, and if they will also be checking for it if other people are already working on the same information. Right now, ELSO has a policy. If another group is already currently working on it, they have 12 months to complete the analysis before that data gets resent out for other people to work on it. So there's not competition of spending so much time and then realizing, boy, that just got published in a popular journal. So it takes a little bit of time to get approved. If you are looking for specific information right now on COVID, we do have some additional requirements that you only have 3 months for exclusive use of the data. And that also has to be then reviewed by what we call the large data set committee. That committee also reviews data which is looking at full populations, like all adult cardiac or all ped pulmonaries, rather than looking at a specific diagnosed subpopulation. If you are looking for a full large data set to do the analysis, it does go through additional scrutiny with the large data set group. On the website, I'm going to put in the chat, there's some nice videos about how to fill out the application. And let me put that in there right now. That's as well as if you explore the website, there's all types of information, where you can get the form and any other information. And we're happy to answer any questions. You can always just email us anytime and we can help you with the process.
That's great. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Peter. And again, we showed briefly there while Mello was answering the question, some links also to ELSO as well as some of the other resources that she had mentioned, and we can show that again at the end of the webinar. And of course, the webinar is being recorded and we can provide those links at the website as well. But again, the ELSO registry is another great example, maybe not a traditional one, but to some of the questions maybe we could approach next from Felix and from Jamin. talking about the importance of multi-center studies, or how do we get collaboration together to get multi-center data, to have an attractive sample size, is something that Felix mentioned. Again, the registry is an excellent example of a global registry that has representation internationally, large sample sizes and large numbers of patients of all kinds of subgroups in different ECMO indications, different underlying disease states. So that's just one example of this, of a large established data source for these sorts of things. But maybe I could ask Daryl to answer first these questions, which are linked. Is what are the advantages or disadvantages of working maybe with data that could be more easily obtained, say, in your own center, and from data that you've collected, maybe for internal purposes, but now want to answer a research question or maybe a quality improvement question or something along those lines, versus trying to reach out and collaborate with other centers to create a multi-center study? What are some of maybe the advantages or disadvantages, or how would someone, like these great questions here, how would you go about creating that collaboration?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question, because there's a lot of value you can get out of a single center observational study. I think probably the biggest advantage is just kind of your tight control over the data, the granularity you can obtain from your own data mining within your EMR. So there's, that's something where what you collect, you can go back in. If you wanted ECMO settings, every hour over the course of an entire ECMO run for as many patients as you had at your center, you could probably obtain that data if you're already collecting that. That's not the granularity of data you're going to get from these large registries like the ELSO registry. But the limitation, as it was alluded to by some of the attendees, is that's not necessarily going to be generalizable. It may not be publishable, depending on what question you're answering and how much data you have and how many patients you have. And that's where it's much more attractive to have a multi-center study, multiple centers contributing their data. But I think you'll almost invariably lose that level of detail and have to sacrifice a little bit of that for a larger population that would have an answer that might be more generalizable. And I would say, from my own experience in designing both single center observational studies and trying to conduct multi-center observational studies, not just what questions you want to answer, but what kind of data do you want to collect, and know that well up front and synchronize that with other centers as you do it. It's easy enough as you go through a question, if you realize as you're going through in your own center, I really would want to know this piece of data too, or you get critiques from reviewers, easy enough to go back in and pull that data if it's something that's collectible, but much harder to do on a larger scale with multiple centers. And even though that other center may collect equal levels of granularity, it might just not sync. And so it's important really ahead of time, if it's a retrospective study, to outline exactly what you want collected, because it can be a huge task depending on the size of the population you're studying. And if you're doing it prospectively, certainly to define that well, and maybe there's a little more flexibility as things move on if you realize that kind of a new question's popping up. As far as how to do it, single center, obviously, you have your own people there. I think it's still valuable in those types of studies. You may not be able to necessarily answer a very sophisticated question or an association, but maybe it's just something that's observed, that's an important observation that then warrants a larger multi-center study. And starting off with that single center question, for example, we published recently on our early mobilization experience across all of our respiratory failure with VV and VA, and demonstrating the feasibility and safety of mobilizing people with femoral VA. Like, that's an important thing to demonstrate the ability to do it, but maybe is not answering a relationship between that and mortality. But then maybe a launching point for a larger study to see how that practice can evolve over multiple centers, or do the findings hold? Is it as safe when you're doing it at centers of different experience? And then how to do it with larger centers. The larger center experience registries inevitably have that, because you have multiple centers contributing to the registry. But I think some other avenues that are worth exploring, that I think there was a website link up there. The International ECMO Network is an opportunity with brilliant scientists in the ECMO field from multiple large volume centers that are often asking questions that are sometimes mechanistic and sometimes on a much larger scale of associations with outcomes, that you can potentially propose an idea and really have that study really well vetted by this group of experts, to see if it's feasible, how you would adjust the design, and then potentially bring in other centers that participate in the International ECMO network. If it's a high enough value study, if it's felt to be really high quality, which then brings in centers that can also contribute data. So that's just one other. I mean, to prospectively look at a multi-center study that you might not know quite what the right questions, or have the right question but not know exactly how to study it, and then you might be able to get some ideas from groups like that. So that's just one organization as an example. So I think there's values to both, and I think it depends somewhat on the question. The exploratory analyses that were mentioned earlier, I think that's really, a single center study can be very valuable there, to then launch the more involved and time-consuming multi-center studies, and not necessarily kind of waste time there if there's not something of value that you found first.
Great, thank you. Bella, did you?
And for those who do pediatric ECMO.
You're muted, Mela. It's okay.
I'm sorry, I thought I unmuted.
Yeah.
So for those who do pediatric ECMO research, the equivalent to ECMONet in pediatrics is the PDECMO Research Collaborative, which is a collaborative between ELSO and POLICI, the Pediatric Acute Lung Injury and Sepsis Investigators. I put the link in the chat, and I think it's in the slides too. And this is open to centers internationally. It's a very enthusiastic group of people, and a very welcoming one too. We all know, especially for pediatric ECMO, that we take care of 1% of our pediatric ICU population, right? Only 1%. So it's really, really important to establish these collaboratives and to work together to find answers that then improve outcomes for our patients.
Great, thank you. Maybe linked to this question, but thinking about collaboration from a slightly different angle, is this question that was placed in the Q&A by Heather, who stated that she's interested in studying the trend of CDH, congenital diaphragmatic hernia repair, on and off ECMO, not sure how to get started. Any advice from the panel? Because I think another important aspect of collaboration is exactly this. There are many people, I'm sure, in our membership who have many great questions that they'd like to answer, and maybe they're just getting started for the first time. And so one is collaborating for the mechanistic point, or the logistical, like to get the data you need, to get the sample size you need. What about collaboration in some of these ways to get, I think, which is very important in clinical research, is the mentorship, right? So how do I have an important question, I'd like to answer it. How do I get started? What about the importance of collaboration or some of these networks for that guidance, in terms of how to get started, how not to fall into a trap early on, how to have a successful approach to answering your research question. And again, I might just, before I let you guys answer, is that here's another reason why I think ELSO is so powerful. I think there's nothing more, and I hope my fellow panelists would agree, is that going to something like the ELSO registry, probably the most rewarding part of that is meeting people who come and you can network, right? So I've got this great question about CDH repair or about CDH, and I apologize, I just don't know who the expert would be, but I'm sure there are many at ELSO, and you go to meet them and you discuss your question. How could I proceed? How should I do this? Who might be good to collaborate with? So maybe, I don't know if the panelists want to offer some advice to people like Heather, who I'm sure there are many who have this question, this great question they'd like to answer, what the value of collaboration could be for this kind of guidance or mentorship in the research world, whether you're just getting started or even for experienced investigators who are maybe trying to answer something that's more complex or difficult. Like maybe there's a value for collaboration or networking on that side of things. I don't know if anybody has any advice on that.
I can start just with some concrete advice, not as much about mentorship, but again, resources. There's also a CDH working group that's extremely active. It's more in the realm of pediatric surgery. That being said, again, this is a very welcoming group too for those in other specialties. neonatology, pulmonology, and so on and so forth. So I entered 2 links for that in the Q&A. I hope that's visible. And then to touch upon what you were just saying, Eddie, about mentorship, I think at the beginning it's a little difficult to step outside of your comfort zone and to reach out to people who are not at your institution, who may seem like very senior figures that maybe are not as accessible, or they seem not to be very accessible. But in general, the vast majority of investigators are actually extremely interested in seeing young and enthusiastic budding researchers starting to complete their training and to start their own research projects, and extremely willing to help, whether it's with information, whether it's with getting them in contact with other experts in the field, whether it's getting them in contact with the principal investigators of a larger study that they can join. And that's a great way to get started, right? To be a site PI for a large study, to really understand how a large study is run while still just managing your own center's enrollment, your own center's data. So yeah, I think taking that first step, sending that first email, reaching out to that person at an in-person conference once they go back live is the hardest, but then it becomes easier, because then you have that relationship and you start attending meetings and you can get going.
Daryl, did you?
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And also, kind of as she alluded to, looking at who's published on the topic from a topic perspective, who's published before, who's published maybe with larger data sets, who's conducted the trials if there have been trials earlier, I think is maybe a good way to just figure out who might be the leaders in the field, or people who have experience researching that topic. And then don't forget to leverage experts in areas that may not be ECMO, but that are, whose skill sets are applicable to the research you're investigating, whether it's from a statistical analysis standpoint, maybe who has experience with emulation trials or with matched pairs analyses, that if that's the idea you have, that you can see, what are the pitfalls early on, or the things that they would recommend doing. When I started getting into kind of some survey work with Mathieu, one of the people we reached out to, or we got connected with, was someone who had no knowledge probably of ECMO whatsoever, but was incredibly valuable from a survey design and methodology standpoint. And it really proved invaluable to our study, because without it, it probably would have been just a not well conducted survey, but really leveraged it. So, and I, I've seen other examples of colleagues who are just really great with certain statistical analyses or just great ideas. So I think just looking beyond the ECMO world, if you have a certain question, if there's certain skill sets that people could bring to the study design.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add some point for the discussion, we have also to consider that having many centers will also induce heterogeneity in terms of management, and this is particularly true in ECMO. So I'm not convinced that it depends what is your research question. If it's very epidemiological research question, I think you need to have lots of centers to answer this kind of question. If it's a very specific management question, having many centers could lead to heterogeneity at the end, which make difficult to answer the question. So sometimes it's single center study, it's complicated, but I mean, multi-center with just few centers, not huge number of centers, might be better for some research question, not all, but some of them, because by this way you have almost an homogeneous management of the ECMO patient. But it's just to bring some point for the discussion, but I will not say that the more centers, the better the study, which is not always the case.
Agreed. I think that's a great point, Mathieu. And obviously, like all things in not just the clinical management of ECMO, but in research, is that it's about the quality, right, of the data and what's being contributed. So I think that's an important perspective also to, as you brought up, to consider. It's not just about adding more centers or more patients, but also the quality of the data and what's being added, and considerations around the complexity that might be added by this heterogeneity, as you mentioned, or variations in practice. That is something else that needs to be considered in the context of an observational study. I might just make a quick announcement again to the group that, for instance, so thanks for engaging, which is great. And Laura Hollinger, who's put some really nice advice to Heather's question about CDH research, about the CDH study group in the chat. That, unfortunately, Laura, is only being seen by us and not by the larger group. So could we ask people to perhaps put all their questions, answers, responses in the Q&A box, because that's actually seen by all participants, and the chat is only seen by us, unfortunately. So it'd be great if, apologies, if you could cut and paste maybe your response there into the Q&A box for Heather, and that would be, I think, and others who probably be very interested in the information you've placed about the CDH study group there. You know, Mathieu, and I think that the discussion here sort of leads, and maybe Mathieu, I'll get you to speak first on this, is that you alluded to at the beginning that not just this heterogeneity and variation, but what are some of the important limitations to observational studies, sort of things that we need to consider? I know there may be, there may seem to be many, but you know, what are some things that we need to consider? So we've refined our question, we've sort of gotten going, we're creating a network, we're trying to collaborate, but what are some limitations of observational studies that we should acknowledge upfront or recognize as we move forward?
The main, in my opinion, the main issue with observational study is that you don't have the benefit of randomization. So you don't, you are unable to control how subjects are assigned to the groups that you want to study, and you are not able to control also which treatment each group will receive. So that's why you have to find the best design, statistical design, or I don't know what to say, but the best design to try to minimize this confounding risk, this selection bias, for example. And that's why the problem of the confounding makes the interpretation of observational studies difficult. And now there are a couple of more sophisticated statistical analysis, which never be as good as an RCT, because you will never be as good as randomization. But at least you can try to minimize this selection bias, all these confounding factors that will make difficult to interpret the study, and which complexify the message.
Great, thank you. Some very important considerations. And maybe just as a way to provide a shameless plug for Mathieu, exactly, I think for in the situation of ECMO we reached recently in the recent or ongoing pandemic, lots of questions early on about the efficacy of ECMO in these severe COVID-19 patients, and whether, you know, early reports from jurisdictions where the pandemic hit early, like in China and Wuhan, where results were actually quite dismal, unfortunately, and calls for a moratorium on ECMO use in COVID patients because of how strained our many jurisdictions' healthcare systems were. It's very resource intensive. Lots of human health resources need to be deployed to manage ECMO patients. And given how complex ECMO is, very difficult in the setting of a pandemic to perhaps conduct and design and conduct an RCT on ECMO specifically in the setting of severe COVID-19. But just to say that Mathieu had recently published using data from France, one of these very sophisticated emulate a target trial. So using observational data to look at what a hypothetical clinical trial might be for ECMO in severe COVID-19 patients, and again, demonstrating a benefit that's quite consistent with our previous knowledge of clinical trials of ECMO in non-COVID populations. So increasing our confidence that even in the absence of an RCT, that in the right patients, ECMO could be used and lead to a benefit. So just another example of how using some of these sophisticated tools, and again, collaborating with our colleagues who have developed these statistical methods and complex analytical techniques could be very useful to answer questions that we couldn't answer before when an RCT is not possible. I don't know if Daryl or Mela, any other thoughts about limitations specifically?
And certainly that's the biggest one. And I think other ways to maybe get around them, because Mathieu's work, your work on emulation trials, often require very large data sets, multiple centers. I think on a smaller scale for single centers, it's just increasingly difficult to publish single center experiences. I think that's one of the drawbacks, even if it has more, maybe more mechanistic studies or novel findings, but certainly things that have been done on larger scales, repeating that in a single center study is probably not likely to get a lot of interest. But sometimes maybe pairing your center that does ECMO, increasingly difficult to find one that doesn't, but centers that don't do ECMO, but perform, equally high quality, provide equally, high quality clinical care, to try and, pair those, because inevitably in your own center to find ones who've received ECMO, compare them to ones who haven't, there's going to be an enormous amount of confounding by indication. So, maybe on a smaller scale, it's still possible, but I think, what you're describing, what Mathieu has accomplished, certainly is, the highest quality for trying to emulate an RCT without actually doing an RCT. But some other ideas for how we might get there with smaller sets.
Great, thank you. And maybe bringing it back now to some more practical advice as we're closing out the webinar, maybe I could ask Mela. So we've discussed a lot of things already, sort of some at a high level about the design, conduct of observational studies, some of the limitations. So maybe each of you, and again, I might start with Mela. So what advice can we provide to researchers, some who've asked some very good questions here, as they get started? Sort of like, I think this is one of the important things, again, about this idea of mentorship, even if it's sort of from a panel perspective, like what pitfalls have you encountered sort of in getting started, answering clinical questions, doing clinical research with observational data, so that we could maybe steer people away from having those same pitfalls as they get started?
I think to start with, really spending adequate amounts of time at the stage of designing the study. Most studies that fail in one way or another fail because of some oversight at the stage of study design. And at that stage, partnering with experts in cohort study design, if that's what it is, experts in biostatistics who truly understand or have developed the methods, the more advanced methods that Mathieu was discussing, and also experts in measuring the outcome of interest, whether that's a bleeding and thrombosis outcome, or whether it's neurocognitive outcomes or radiographic type outcome. None of us is a jack of all trades, and finding those experts, again, reaching out and getting outside of your bubble of close colleagues and friends is extremely important to have a successful study. And then some of the logistics are also very important, right? So developing robust case report forms, leveraging electronic medical record data when that is available, for those, but only for those variables that are of high quality, and overall treating data collection for observational studies with the same amount of rigor that data collection is done for randomized control trials that tend to have a bit more oversight because of regulatory issues. Just the fact that there is no intervention and the regulatory burden is a little less for observational studies than for randomized controlled trials, it doesn't mean that the quality of the data collected and the rigor should be lower. So I think those are some of the things that come to mind. But of course, there's a lot of other considerations.
That's great. Thank you. Mathieu, did you?
Yeah, no, I do agree with Melania, and I think after having defined what is your research question, I think with experience now, I pay much more attention on the CRF, and if you want to collaborate with some centers, some friends, you have to send a CRF, to create a CRF which you're gonna pick only the data that's gonna be useful for the final paper. Otherwise, you increase the burden of the CRF. No one will do it, or they will do it with many missing data. And at the end, you have a CRS with lots of empty cases, and it's going to be tricky to answer your research question. So every time you ask your data in the CRF, ask yourself, will it be useful to answer my research question? And at the beginning, I wanted to have many data of many things in case of, but after a couple of years now, and I have reduced the size of the CRF just to be focused on my research question. And by this way, you get nicer data with more granularity and more focus on the research question. And then you can provide a good message, I mean, a true message with good external validity. Otherwise, it's going to, and also it's much easier when you have a good CRF, a complete CRF, even if it's just few cases for a specific question. It's much easier also to do complex statistical analysis with that. If you have too missing data, everything is much more complicated. Sorry. So pay attention to the painful part, which is the CRF. But anyway, I think it's very important to have good data at the end, 1 or 2 years later. It's very important for that.
That's also great advice. It's the choosing wisely of clinical research, and less is more. So yes. Less, more economical data collection, but then more focus on the quality of those important data points that are being collected. So very important advice.
And as the recipient of several Mathieu's case report forms, I completely agree.
And then, so maybe Daryl, I'll ask you, I don't know if you also have any advice, but also maybe to finish off by saying, so we've paid attention to all these things. We've carefully defined the question. We've spent a lot of painful hours on the CRF, and we've gotten collaborators, we've gotten our study, our data. Maybe if you have any advice about the pitfalls, but also then maybe some general advice on, so what next? So how do I get my message, my results? How do I get it out to the broader ECMO community so they could benefit from the results or the analysis that I've conducted?
Sorry, my connection's a little bad. If you can hear me.
Yeah,
I think question, but how do you then, get?
You're back. I think it's a bit better now, Daryl.
Yes. Okay, good. So yeah, so I think a lot of what a lot of the methods that were discussed are really so vital then to have a high quality study. One with few missing data, with the more sophisticated statistical analyses to kind of, when appropriate, best emulate what would otherwise be done with an RCT. Although maybe that's not your intention, if it's mechanistic or if it's simply an observational cohort study where you want to demonstrate some new finding. But I think targeting journals is more so than people targeting, what kind of journal do you think this is appropriate for? Where do is there interest from that journal? Do they have a history of publishing this type of data, these types of analyses? Is this, you're probably not getting a 5-patient cohort study in the New England Journal, but have, certainly more journals these days are interested in some level of multi-center study, some sort of comparator groups. I think that's an important thing actually also for design is, a lot of these registries are patients who already received ECMO. And it's important, if you can, to have comparator groups in parallel that, provide more context for, how much was it ECMO and how much was it other co-interventions. But I think, collaboration with people with a track record of successful publications at journals that ideally high impact factors, but ones with a history of publishing this type of data and an interest in ECMO. You can try to target them early. You can reach out to journals and see if they'd be interested in something before submitting. I think many times you're left submitting to one, waiting to see if they want it. But equally important is the reviews you get back, even if you don't get accepted to the first journal, incorporating their comments and critiques into the subsequent versions to try and improve upon it, even if they don't want to see it again for the next journal you want to try it for. So there's a lot of value in even not getting it published off the bat, because it oftentimes results in a stronger paper. I'm not sure if that helped answer.
That's great. Matthew, did you? No.
No, I totally agree with that review.
Great. Yeah, I think, maybe if I could mention, agreed. I think the key thing is often once you have your results in a manuscript, often it's really just about finding the best way to get the message out there. And I think as time goes on, certainly maybe I'll just speak for myself, is the idea of publishing in the highest impact journal has become less and less of an important thing than getting the message out there sometimes. Because if your findings are important, for whether it's a large part of the community or a small part of the community, really the way to get the message out there is to get it published. And we have many examples in the medical literature and even in the ECMO community where some of our most most impactful studies were not published in the New England Journal or JAMA or the Lancet, but in journals that people were reading at the time, and they were just trying to get the message out there. So I think it's important, obviously, is to try to not fall into this, maybe the pitfall I'll offer is this idea that every time I do a study, I need to hit a home run and publish it in the New England Journal or publish it in JAMA. I think that maybe expends a lot of both emotional and intellectual energy, and sometimes getting your message out there. But the other great thing, again, I might just plug, is to present your findings at meetings, because lots of your colleagues come to meetings. It's a great way to get the message out there. The ELSO conference, again, is another example where the whole international community and as well as ELSO's chapters are hearing these presentations. And of course now social media is another great way to at least get your message out there to a broader audience. And we're fortunate here also at ELSO to have a very robust social media support. Velia is here on our panel discussion helping us with that as well. So maybe just some other examples of ways to get your message out once your results are in.
And just maybe one more thing to add, I completely agree, Eddie, about just not necessarily trying to hit a home run every time, because a lot of times that will also result in long delays until you actually do find a journal that will publish it. And sometimes you get scooped. There might be someone else who's doing the same exact thing, and it's better to just hit it, target a journal you think you have a good shot at, that is PubMed indexed, that the message is going to get out for, instead of waiting months for journal after journal after journal. So there's definitely value in that approach.
Fantastic. So maybe just to round things out, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, just a few things. If I could ask Christine perhaps to put up we have some resources that we might point you to. Again, we showed before, but here are some nice articles recently in a few different kinds of journals, sort of providing some of this overview about observational research. Some of these papers on everything you wanted to know but were afraid to ask. Sometimes when even observational studies could be better than randomized controlled trials, and some guidelines on reporting. And reporting guidelines for observational studies are important because knowing what you have to report helps you to think about what you need to consider when you're designing the study, because eventually you need to report these things as sort of best practices. So here are some potential resources. Again, all the panelists have talked about some other web links or resources that could be available. And so on the next two slides, we have some additional links as well. Some you might be familiar with ELSO, other consortia or organizations that we've mentioned, like the COVID-19 Critical Care Consortium, PALISI, PD ECMO, International ECMO Network, the AHA Get With The Guidelines Resuscitation Network, if you're interested in sort of resuscitation research, or ACPR, for instance. So lots of, this is just a snapshot. Obviously, there are many more resources than this, but just a way to get things started. And maybe just again to offer that for people like who are asking how to get started or have questions, or how do I collaborate, or how do I get started? Again, please reach out to us here at ELSO with the research committee. Members of the scientific oversight committee probably would also be very interested in helping. And again, if it's not us, we might steer you in the right direction. And hopefully, again, use the opportunity that the ELSO meeting this year is in Boston in the fall. Hope to see many of you there, and come ready with your questions. And please feel free to approach people that you'd like to maybe collaborate with, ask questions from. And of course, if all else fails, you can ask Dr. Bartlett, who has the answer to all questions. He might be a good source if you don't find the person that you are specifically looking for. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We hope the first of a few to help tackle some of these issues about getting started with clinical research in ECMO. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email us. This recording and the slides and resources will be available on the ELSO website shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.